Hey everybody, subscribe to the Datasets channel and support us on Patreon. This video compiles the smartest US presidents of all time. Joe Biden has an IQ score of 115. Ulysses S. Grant had an IQ score of 120. Warren G. Harding had an IQ score of 124. Andrew Johnson had an IQ score of 125. Calvin Coolidge had an IQ score of 127. William Howard Taft had an IQ score of 126. Harry S. Truman had an IQ score of 128. Zachary Taylor had an IQ score of 129. James Buchanan had an IQ score of 129. Ronald Reagan had an IQ score of 130. William McKinley had an IQ score of 130. Herbert Hoover had an IQ score of 130. James K. Polk had an IQ score of 130. Richard Nixon had an IQ score of 132. Dwight D. Eisenhower had an IQ score of 132. William Henry Harrison had an IQ score of 132. Martin Van Buren had an IQ score of 133. John Tyler had an IQ score of 136. James Monroe had an IQ score of 139. George W. Bush has an IQ score of 139. Gerald Ford had an IQ score of 140. George Washington had an IQ score of 140. Lyndon B. Johnson had an IQ score of 140. Abraham Lincoln had an IQ score of 140. James A. Garfield had an IQ score of 141. Chester A. Arthur had an IQ score of 142. George H. W. Bush had an IQ score of 143. Theodore Roosevelt had an IQ score of 143. Grover Cleveland had an IQ score of 144. Donald Trump had an IQ score of 145. Andrew Jackson had an IQ score of 145. Benjamin Harrison had an IQ score of 145. Woodrow Wilson had an IQ score of 145. Rutherford B. Hayes had an IQ score of 146. Franklin Pierce had an IQ score of 147. Millard Fillmore had an IQ score of 149. Franklin D. Roosevelt had an IQ score of 150. Barack Obama has an IQ score of 155. John Adams had an IQ score of 155. James Madison had an IQ score of 155. Jimmy Carter has an IQ score of 157. Bill Clinton has an IQ score of 159. John F. Kennedy had an IQ score of 160. Thomas Jefferson had an IQ score of 160. John Quincy Adams had an IQ score of 175. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the Datasets channel and support us on Patreon.